Why do a video on the Pope's coffin, you might ask? It seems on face value to be a bit of a creepy and esoteric topic, but there are many reasons why it is a rather interesting subject to explore. Death is a part of the human condition, there is no escaping it, and funerary practices have a lot to teach us about social attitudes to death in the past, and attitudes to death and dying tell us, in turn, much about the development of culture and tradition. The funeral rites of a pope, even a reformist pope like Pope Francis, are very conservative and they preserve much of past tradition. What's more, they are very public, and so the form of the papal coffin is made visible. We therefore have before us a fascinating source of information on the development of tradition. That in turn gives a rather unique insight not only into papal funerals, but into funerary practices that were once widespread across European culture and have now mostly fallen into disuse. Now in 2024, Pope Francis reformed the instructions and texts for papal funerals in a reissue of a liturgical text that was first published in the year 2000. It is called the Ordo Exequarum Romani Pontificius, the rite of burial for Roman pontiffs. One of the aspects of the funeral Pope Francis simplified was the form of the coffin that popes have traditionally been buried in, but I'll get on to what changes he made a bit later. They're not really that revolutionary. Up to and including the funeral of Pope Benedict XVI in 2022, popes have long been buried in a three-part coffin, which is a bit like a set of Russian dolls, with the three elements fitting snugly together. The three elements of the coffin each have a particular technical name in English. There is an inner box of timber lined with fabric. This is the coffin proper. This was in turn set within a metal coffin or surround that is properly termed a shell, usually made of lead. This is in turn set within a larger outer box of coffins were used in England from the 17th century onwards. In fact, they were used throughout the whole of Western Europe. This method for enclosing a corpse for burial was an evolution in the early modern period of the late medieval tradition, one I've spoken about in other videos on medieval royal funerals, of wrapping a dead body in cerecloth, waxed cloth, soldering it into an anthropoidal lead shell, and then placing that in a timber case. At some point, someone realised you could achieve the same ends with less hassle by simply providing a three-part coffin. Such three-part coffins were provided when a body was either to be subjected to very lengthy funeral rituals or was to be interred within a church building, rather than directly in the ground of a churchyard or cemetery. Inhumation in church buildings was quite commonplace up until the 19th century, and from the late 16th century onwards, almost always took place within the context of a subterranean burial. The three-part coffin was developed as an entirely practical expedient for two reasons. Firstly, to ensure the coffin maintained structural integrity for a long period of time, and second, or even the environment of the coffin. Putrefaction, slower processes of anaerobic decay still took place within the hermetically sealed environment of the coffin. Interestingly, we have lots of evidence from papal exhumations in the 19th and 20th, and John the 23rd were all exhumed in the 20th century. Their bodies were found to still be reasonably intact and had more or less been mummified by the conditions within the three-part coffin. Such coffins, with their use of very costly materials, including a good deal of lead, were expensive, and they were initially the preserve of the social elite, of bishops and the upper clergy, royalty, nobility and gentry, although as time went on, the middle classes increasingly used them too. It is not just for papal funerals that such coffins are used today, it is simply that we don't get to see the structure of them in the same way that we do at a pope's burial. For example, Her Late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II and her husband, the Duke of Edinburgh, were similarly buried in three-part coffins within the vault below King George VI's chapel in Windsor Castle. The British were a bit squeamish about these things, and at their funerals we didn't even get a glimpse of the wood of the outer case of the coffin, as they were hidden under funeral palls. So let's have a look in detail at the structure of the papal coffin, using as our primary guide the evidence we have from the funeral of Pope Benedict XVI, who died a little over 2 years ago. At the end of his lying in state in St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican, Pope Benedict's body was placed inside a coffin that was made of cypress wood. There is no symbolism to the timber used, of wood, and is also easy to work, and takes a nice stain and polish. As a resinous wood, it is to a large degree water in the funerary cocktail joints, and it was lined, as per tradition, with red velvet. One thing that is rather distinctive about papal coffins is the cypress coffin of Pope Benedict was taken down to the grotto under St. Peter's and to his burial site. The first thing that was undertaken then was the sealing of the coffin. It was bound with red ribbon, one running lengthways and one widthways, which are then sealed with sealing wax, into which was impressed the seal of office of the Camerlengo of the Holy Roman Church. The cardinal have not been tampered with if at a later date the coffin is then exhumed, if, say, the particular pope is declared a saint. The sealed cypress coffin is then placed into the outer elm case, which is already lined on the inside with the lead shell. The lid of the lead shell is then put on top of the cypress coffin, and the overlap from the sides of the shell are turned down and soldered to the lid by the Vatican plumbers, with further seals being inset into the molten solder as they progress. On the lid of the lead shell are attached 3 bronze coffin plates. The first is a cross, then below it is a coffin plate bearing the name, style, title and dates of the occupant, while below that is the occupant's papal arms. Then the lid of the outer elm case is put in place and it is fixed down. Now on this lid, the bronze coffin plates are then repeated. Now, interestingly, some earlier papal coffins had a rather fetching skull and crossbones as a piece of coffin furniture on the lid. This photo shows the coffins prepared for Pope Pius XII in 1958, and you can see the skull and crossbones on the outer case. Repeating the coffin plates on the outer lid of the case, as well as on the lead shell, is a traditional feature of such coffins right across Europe, and there's a really good reason for it. After many hundreds of years, it is usual for the outer wooden case of coffins of this sort to begin to decay, to gradually fall to pieces, and for the outer coffin plates to fall away as the timber then disintegrates. It is striking how quickly such decay begins to become apparent. This is the coffin of Pope John Paul II, exhumed at his beatification 6 years after his death. The surface polish has already begun to disappear on the outer case, and the tight vault or a catacomb. The outer cases are... This is what coffins of this form tend to look like after 150 years or so, to reveal the vault floor. The lead shells take much longer to decay, and so a set of coffin plates attached to that ensures that remains can still be identified. The platform on which the Pope's body was traditionally displayed on cushions, and his body has been put directly into a prepared coffin from which he will now not be removed. And this has necessitated some structural changes to the coffin's form. The coffin is quite evidently not just a simple and humble timber box. It is still a multi-part coffin. Pope Francis is to be buried in a burial vault below the floor of the Church of Santa Maria Maggiore, and so some precautions need to be made to ensure that the coffin is a sealed receptacle. We know from the new edition of Ordo Exequiarum that the coffin is to be of timber lined with zinc rather than lead. The coffin is the same trapezoidal shape of the previous pope's remain. Pope Benedict was buried in procession. Zinc is almost half as light by mass than lead. The strip of red velvet material when the coffin will be closed, the inner zinc shell, and the other to the coffin is not really a great revolution. Yes, there is innovation in form. You're bound to enjoy my magazine.